Well, good afternoon, and thank you for attending our virtual town hall, Undoing the Harm of the War on Drugs, hosted by Voices of Hope, a Lexington-based recovery community center and sponsored by the Healing Community Study. My name is Alex Ellswick. I'm a person in long-term recovery, and I'll be serving as moderator today.
Nope, you're muted.
Hey, Shelton, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Hey, Alex.
Thank you. All right, we've fixed our technical difficulties. We'll try again. Good afternoon, and thank you for attending our virtual town hall, Undoing the Harm of the War on Drugs, hosted by Voices of Hope, a Lexington-based recovery community center and sponsored by the Healing Community Study. My name is Alex Ellswick. I'm a person in recovery, and I'll be serving as the moderator for today. Unpacking the war on drugs is an immense undertaking, and we've only got 3 hours, so we're going to get started. We know the war on drugs has failed, at least with respect to its goal to reduce or eradicate drug use. Since 1970, the United States has incarcerated more citizens per capita than any other country in the world. In that time, we've seen no appreciable reduction in drug use or associated harms. And yet, the most harmful legacy of the war on drugs has been its disproportionate impact on communities of color. Black Americans represent 5% of illicit drug users, but represent 29% of those arrested for drug offenses and 33% of those convicted. To this day, the recovery community has yet to meaningfully reconcile this historical and ongoing injustice. If recovery really is, as SAMHSA suggests, about improving health and wellness, living a self-directed life, and striving to reach one's own potential, then the war on drugs is most certainly a barrier for our brothers and sisters in recovery. But what do we mean by the war on drugs? How and why have communities of color been disproportionately impacted? How does this disparity impact recovery from substance use disorder? And what is the role of recovery advocacy in the broader social justice movements of the day, namely anti-racism? It's these questions and the like that we'll be exploring today. So to give you an idea of where we're going, we'll take a look at our agenda. We're going to begin with a personal conversation with Shelton McElroy to learn about personal experience with the war on drugs. And then we'll learn about the history of the war on drugs from Dr. Claire Clark. We'll take a short break of about 10 minutes, and then we'll move into our expert panel. And finally, we'll finish with my friend Jeremy Byard to talk about strategies that we can employ going forward. So I'll begin today. To begin, we want to establish that this isn't a theoretical or academic conversation, nor is it merely a historical conversation. Racism and the war on drugs have a real, personal, present impact. Shelton McElroy is the former National Director of Strategic Partnerships of the Bail Project. Shelton has worked with parent advocacy and participatory defense in Louisville, Kentucky, assisting parents in the reunification process with their children and using organizing tools to fight the criminal justice system. As a formerly incarcerated individual who was a ward of the state in foster care for over 15 years, Shelton works daily to dismantle dehumanizing systems of oppression. Shelton also serves on the board of directors of the Louisville Recovery Community Connection, the first recovery community organization in Louisville, Kentucky. Shelton, thank you for being here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thank you, Alec. And thank you, Voices of Hope. And I can't help but dishonor this timeliness of having a conversation about the war on drugs, considering the space that we're in which on one hand we have an epidemic in regards to opioid use, and yet when drugs were delineated by race, such as crack, we had a war on drugs. So thank you for hosting this conversation.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here. You're no stranger to the war on drugs, right? In fact, beginning at a young age, you experienced what we could call some of the casualties of the war on drugs. So can you tell us about your experience in foster care and how that relates to the war on drugs?
Yeah, so, my mother was 14 when she had my oldest brother and 16 when she had me. And she was homeless. and was actually being trafficked. Her body was being trafficked. And at about 18 was when she had come into contact with law enforcement, and this was right at the precipice of the war on drugs and this extreme heavy-handedness, right? So, this is the early 80s, when at that time, there were about 300,000 people in prison nationally. And close to the early 90s, when my mother had, first went to prison, we were pushing the throes of millions of people in prison, and that being a direct outgrowth of the war on drugs. And then in 95, I would be in prison at 18 years old as a direct outgrowth of the war on drugs. My mother literally had her children removed from her. She went to Pee Wee Valley. We went into foster care. She got no accommodations in regards to treatment, no mental health assistance. It was complete punitive. And the child welfare system, they had no reunification process. They actually, interesting enough, had expedited children being permanently terminated from their parents. So they had expedited that process. In around 85. There were laws that came out, federal regulations that expedited a child being removed from a parent and the process in which a parent could actually reunify. And if a parent had not made substantial achievements toward their plan in the first 9 months, then total permanent rights could be taken. And that was what happened in regards to my mother. And like I said, you can't divorce the child welfare system and what was happening to her by way of her substance abuse addiction from the war on drugs, because the war on drugs was guised as this thing that targeted really Black men that were selling drugs, right? What I was in for. They were really astonished that I was looking at so much time and that I was not released on my own recognizance. I will tell you that the charges that I was convicted of held a maximum of 5 years and a minimum of 1 year. My public defender came to me and said, hey, the prosecutor is making you an offer for 4 years. I'm 18 years old. I have no criminal history whatsoever, but I also have limited capacity to understand the legal system. And I'm completely dependent on and vulnerable to my public defender and the judicial system at this point. And I thought 4 beat 5.
Well, in addition to your personal experience, you've amassed a great deal of experience as an advocate for justice reform. And so I want to ask you the big question. If you had unlimited resources, what would you do? What would you direct us to do? What would you direct government to do to rectify the harms of the war on drugs?
Yes, so that's a very powerful question. I'll tell you, I'll start very contemporarily, right? So right now, like, I'll set the war on drugs aside, but keep it in mind, this is all directly connected. Right now, we have an epidemic of COVID that is unleashing devastation on our entire country. And one of two of the most vulnerable groups and populations impacted by COVID, both of them happen to be community living spaces. And both of them happen to have the least political power. One of them are senior citizen homes, and the other are jails and prisons. I liken it to if you looked up and you look at a building and it is burning. I mean, the fire is raging, and that happens to be a jail or a prison, is it the right thing to do for what we deem public safety, to leave people in that burning building? And that's what we're doing today. With the ravages of COVID-19, we are leaving human beings that do not deserve to be faced with death day in and day out from an illness they cannot safely distance from, do not have access to proper PPE or a healthcare system. We are leaving them in a burning building. And sociologists and scientists and history will show us that we were inhumane to the population of people that we have so decimated by way of COVID-19. So I would immediately, if I had it within my power and the resources to do so, would immediately release every single person on pretrial incarceration. If you're on pretrial incarceration, there are tried and true strategies to ensure that you will return to court, even if accused of some of the most heinous crimes. There are tried and true practices that will ensure that you will return to court. You can use ankle monitors. I prefer them not, but I'm saying if you're talking about the most heinous of people that you're so afraid of, there are ways in which you can monitor them and still keep them in a place where they can be social distance, have access to proper PPE, testing, healthcare, etc. You could shrink the jail budget to the degree that those resources could be redirected to support people with mental health, substance abuse, the very barriers and challenges that make it so that people actually don't show up to court. You could actually create strategies and interventions to be preventative. So the pretrial population would immediately, I would look at, and I've seen our governor has done an assessment and has been advised, and there's been people released. It's not enough. It's not enough. I personally get phone calls from people that are a month, 2 months away from the parole board, a month, 2 months away from serving out, and they are still held in jails and prisons. They should be released. They should be released. They should be released. And we should bring that population down dramatically so that there could be space, so that there could be social distancing. And we should increase through the savings that we would receive from having less people, PPE and healthcare on the behalf of those that are left behind. That would be what I would first do. I would first focus on our current state of epidemic that we are in, the pandemic we are in. And then when you talk about the war on drugs and its devastation, there's so much reparations that need to be had. We're in the middle of 20 states in which it is legal in some way or form, whether medical or recreational, to have marijuana. And we don't have a real agenda on what it looks like to go back retroactively and restore people that have been so drastically impacted by the draconian drug laws that we push. So I would immediately start a task force to assess reparations and restoration for those that have been devastated. I would take and juxtapose to every recovery community. I would beg to ask this question. If your response, as appropriate and necessary as it may be, was one of a healthcare response to the opioid epidemic, and your response to the crack cocaine catastrophe was not, I would beg of you to think about a strategy of reparations and restoration to the community that you watch be devastated while you demonize them by not putting forth policy, practice, and procedure that would be supportive, caring, loving as you are today in the opioid epidemic.
Shelton, I'm sorry we don't have a whole lot more time together. We've only got 3 minutes, but to conclude, I want to ask you an uncomfortable question, or at least it's a question that makes me uncomfortable when I considered asking it. We've talked a lot about what you've experienced, but we haven't talked as much about how you've experienced it. And so what I want to know is what it's like to be treated differently because of the color of your skin, and maybe what's worse, to be acutely aware of the fact that you're being treated differently because of the color of your skin. How did that make you feel? And maybe how did that change your view of yourself in relation to the world?
Yeah. Well, thank you for that question. It is a really difficult question, and it's not a usual question. It's a question that gets to love. Martin Luther King Jr. said that when America catches a cold, African Americans catch the flu. He said that African Americans have half of what's good in America and twice of what's bad in America. Oftentimes, the feelings of racism create an inferiority complex within the Black body. And it's not just an emotional sensation, it's a physical sensation. You feel it in your blood pressure, you feel it in your headaches, you feel it in your gut. It's a feeling like no other. You shrink in your seats when in high school history class, the only conversation about the Black community in their textbooks is a small, disheveled, enslaved human being. And you don't look forward to that section. The curriculum throughout elementary, K through 12, tells you that you're minuscule. We even use terms like minority. I couldn't imagine my mother, when I was born, she looked at me and said, "My minority baby." The racial inferiority complex that white supremacy gives Black, brown people contributes to the shortness of life that we also experience. It kills us. It kills us. It kills us, Alex. Thank you for asking that question. Thank you for letting me be on this conversation. Thank you, Voices of Hope.
Thank you, Shelton, for being here and for sharing your time and experience and for being the authentic person you are. I appreciate you. So we've heard that racism and the war on drugs have had a profoundly negative impact on the life of Shelton and many, many people like him. Next, we're going to discuss how we got here to today, to Shelton, and how racism drove the architecture of the war on drugs from its very inception. So here to give us that historical perspective is my friend and my colleague, Dr. Claire Clark. Dr. Claire Clark is a medical historian and an associate professor in University of Kentucky's Department of Behavioral Science. Claire is the author of Recovery Revolution, which describes the history of treatment activists' influence on the development of American drug policy. Dr. Clark, thank you for sharing your time and experience with us. The floor is yours. You're muted.
Of course I
Linda,
am. That's a hard act to follow, but I'm delighted to be here. Let me see if I can share my screen. Okay. You may not know this, but the reason why George Floyd was in Minneapolis to begin with was because he had moved there from Houston to seek recovery. And the morning before he stepped out the door of his house to be murdered, he and his roommate prayed together for over an hour. I'm starting the presentation with, this is a list of George Floyd's resolutions to himself. So it's the last list that he made before he was murdered. And among those resolutions are, let this be the day I claim victory over the dark situation over this dark situation through the Holy Spirit. And notes to himself like, get up, gather yourself in the morning, feed your spirit. Follow that with your workout. I open with this note to illustrate how George Floyd's, I don't even know if we can call it a recovery journey or struggle to recover, because it had nothing to do with all of the concepts that we usually talk about when we talk about challenges in recovery. It had nothing to do with lack of faith, lack of willpower, lack of effort. And it really had everything to do with the social structures that ultimately made his murder possible. So in this presentation today, what I'd like to do is to describe how these structures were built over the course of the 20th century and how they were built by both liberals and conservatives, by medical professionals, as well as the criminal justice system. And my focus here will be less on whether each of the historical figures that I talk about, Harry Anslinger, Richard Nixon, is a racist, although some of them were quite explicitly racist, and more about how the policies they implemented were racist in the sense that the policies had inequitable and tragic consequences for communities of color. All right, so if you'll see from the timeline here that we're locating the beginning of the war on drugs in 1914. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what life was like before. So before the early 20th century, food and drugs were basically completely unregulated. You could go to the pharmacy, you see here a picture on your left, and you could buy toothache drops for your children that were laced with cocaine. You could buy cough syrup that had heroin in it. In the mid to late 1800s, the prototypical opiate user was a middle-class white woman who obtained her supply from her doctors or pharmacists. It was only after opiates started being associated with immigrant groups and urban so-called vice districts that the notion of the non-medical or criminal addict emerged. So the very first targets of anti-drug laws were Chinese immigrants, and you see here a picture of a New York opium den from 1881 from the National Library of Medicine. Cities such as San Francisco did not ban opium. They banned opium dens. This was part of a broader fight against Chinese immigration, things like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. But what it did essentially was to draw a kind of a racialized boundary through emerging opium markets that would define those who are the people who counted as consumers, the people who were buying their opiates from the pharmacy, and then who are the people who counted as criminals, the people who were buying their opium from the opium den. And this laid the groundwork for the Harrison Narcotic Act. So the Harrison Narcotic Act was not an outright prohibition. It was a little more complicated than that. What it was a tax. It was a tax act, and it levied a tax on all narcotic transactions. And that meant that all market actors, if you were an importer, a manufacturer, a distributor, a physician, a pharmacist, you had to register with the federal government and record your transactions. And if the federal government didn't let you register, you weren't allowed to register, then you couldn't pay the tax. And then possessing narcotics without having paid the tax was a crime. So essentially, by making it so that people couldn't deal in narcotics, any traffic in narcotics was illegal, and federal agents enforced the law. And you can see here in this image, federal agents are destroying unregistered narcotics that they have seized. The impact on communities of color was that consumers who could no longer purchase narcotics through prescription were more often working class, poor, from stigmatized racial groups. They were sort of caught up in law enforcement. Physicians stopped prescribing medical maintenance therapies. So physicians' attitudes turned from looking at addiction as being primarily a medical problem to being a criminal problem, and eventually no longer supplying prescriptions to anyone on an outpatient basis. And the American Association of Medicine actually opposed non-institutional treatment of addiction in 1920. So that meant that by 1920, there was no such thing as outpatient treatment. So whether you were going to jail or whether you were going to treatment, you were going to an institution. But most importantly, what the Harrison Narcotics Act did was to create the divide between illicit medicines that were purchased by consumers and informal market drugs, which were purchased by what became constructed as criminals, as addicts. And so this is where, when Shelton talks about the opioid epidemic, we look at the opioid epidemic one way as a problem of illicit medicines, and we look at the crack epidemic as being something else. We can trace the origins of that divide back to the Harrison Narcotics Act. In 1930, the federal enforcement agency, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, was founded with Harry J. Anslinger as the commissioner. And in 1937, he successfully lobbied for the Anti-Marijuana Tax Act. Now, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics was really the first federal agency that was responsible for drug traffic. So these agents, there weren't very many of them, but they surveilled communities of color. They enforced informal market drug laws, and they did this both nationally and internationally. And Anslinger lobbied to prohibit marijuana in a manner similar to opiates and cocaine. So put forth the Anti-Marijuana Tax Act, which was modeled on the Harrison Narcotics Act. And I would note that this picture here, you can see Anslinger is the bald guy in the middle, and he's standing next to President John F. Kennedy. Anslinger remained commissioner of the FBN from 1930 until 1962, when he actually received a Medal of Commendation from President Kennedy for his work over that 30-year period. And that work was explicitly and consciously racist. He targeted through propaganda and through legislation. He and through policing, he targeted Blacks, Mexicans, played on stereotypes of Asians. And he says this in this book. You'll see the quote from The Murderers, which is the murderers are anyone who uses marijuana, essentially. And he writes about his campaign to pass the Anti-Marijuana Tax Act. And he says, on radio and major forums, I told the story of this evil weed of fields and riverbeds and roadsides. I wrote articles for magazines. In network broadcasts, I reported on the growing list of crimes, including murder and rape. He had a very famous sort of gore file. I described the nature of marijuana and its close kinship to hashish, which he then associated with Muslims. So Anslinger and the Federal Bureau of Narcotics targeted jazz musicians for high-profile arrests. They, coordinated press coverage with William Randolph Hearst publications. And by 1958, 59% of the active addicts being tracked by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics were Black. So people who had been registered or been forced to be registered as users of narcotics were disproportionately Black. Okay, well, what happened after Anslinger's retirement? Well, the next two presidents, Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon, built an infrastructure of policing and incarceration that ultimately formed the foundation of the war on drugs as it was declared by Reagan. So war on poverty, I'll talk about war on poverty programs, war on crime programs, and how they sort of laid the foundation for Ronald Reagan's war on drugs, which led to many of the policies that Sheldon just referenced. So here in this picture, you can see Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson seated together. As part of Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty, he established the Office of Economic Opportunity, that's in 1964. And this was designed to develop anti-poverty programs and fund urban demonstration projects. So the idea was community-based programming would help combat poverty and crime in urban areas, and that promising demonstration projects could then be scaled up on a federal level. And the Law Enforcement Assistance Act, which was passed the following year, essentially militarized local police operations. These two things had devastating consequences for communities of color. So their ideology relied on the pathologization of Black families. So the understanding was that the pathology of the Black family was at the root of poverty. Poverty was at the root of crime. And therefore, and this is how we moved from a war on poverty to a war on crime that's really a war on Black people. What happened was that there's a disinvestment from community action programs and other social welfare initiatives that seemed so promising at the beginning of the war on poverty, and instead an investment in more punitive and militaristic interventions. And so the police and the National Guard, this is a quote from LAPD Police Chief William Parker after the Watts riots. We're treating these communities as though they were engaged in urban guerrilla warfare, and as very much like fighting the Viet Cong. And this is when we see the beginning of the use of things like no-knock raids that were used in the killing of Breonna Taylor, and military equipment being made, like tanks, being made available to local police forces. And I'll just read the beginning of this article about Johnson kind of announcing his sort of war, his agenda. It starts, it says, quote, "Robbers, rapists, and street hoodlums, rather than the big league Cosa Nostra characters," I suppose means foreign drug dealers, "are expected to be the targets of Johnson's message on crime." So, so this rhetoric and policies that started under President Kennedy, President Johnson, continue under President Richard Nixon, and he is elected to the presidency in 1968, running on a campaign against that sort of declares war on crime and urban unrest. And soon after declaring this running on this sort of war on crime, he would more explicitly declare war. He doesn't actually use that term. Reagan is the one who uses it, but he used the term all-out offensive on public enemy number one. And that's drug abuse. And so here is President Richard Nixon at his press conference, and he's announcing the formation of new federal agencies, which would eventually be the Drug Enforcement Administration, and that would deal with drug trafficking, and then the Special Action Office of Drug Abuse Prevention, which would be more focused on prevention and treatment. And the drug laws that Nixon will be enforcing are not the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act any longer, but the Controlled Substances Act. So the Controlled Substances Act is supposed to be a more rational system for regulating substances. So this is the system we have today, where we have Schedule I drugs through Schedule V drugs. And there are mechanisms for substances to be added to schedules or transferred between schedules. And it takes into account, the Department of Health and Human Services, drug manufacturers, medical societies, special interest groups, sort of like supposed to be a kind of a big tent sort of compromise and more rational. But of course it was political, of course, as well. And so the Schedule I substance, so heroin remains a Schedule I substance, and LSD and marijuana, which Sheldon talked about being arrested for, are also scheduled as Schedule I substances. So the Nixon administration plans to get tough on crime, runs on this platform, ties crime to drugs and drug use, and has a blueprint essentially for mass incarceration. And that's what this image that I'm showing is. You can see this is a 1970 plan, and it's a plan to increase incarceration. You can see, I don't know if you can see my arrow there, but I am trying to point out to you. This is the estimated this is the estimated thousands of inmates, prison population. They are planning on increasing the prison population. And then they are planning, scaling up prison capacity to exceed that population. So this was a very coordinated and intentional decision to invest in punitive policies. So by the time Reagan declares outright war on drugs, which is in 1982, and then this is really, I would say, sort of codified in the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, a substantial portion of the population have, these two previous wars, let's say, these two previous wars have sort of framed or conditioned people to view Black families as being pathological, urban communities as being crime-ridden, and punitive criminal justice measures as being the solution to these perceived social problems. Okay. So the Anti-Drug Abuse Act establishes mandatory minimum sentences for drug possession and immense sentencing disparities between possession and trafficking for powder cocaine, which would predominantly predominantly run in sort of by white people, and crack cocaine, which predominantly affected Black communities. And so this is a 100 to 1 disparity. And it absolutely decimates Black families and communities in the way that Sheldon discussed. So, and this happens in a couple of different ways, but there's a panic over Black women who use drugs, and their children are taken away. And then sentencing disparities just skyrocket. So between 1986 and 1990, Blacks received prison sentences that were 11% or longer than whites. And by 1990, the difference is 49%. The number of Black children in foster care doubles. And there's a really intentional effort to break apart Black families and in a way that is not, as Sheldon mentioned, not empathetic and quite distinct from how the policies and therapeutic options that we are seeing and hoping to develop in response to the opioid epidemic of more recent years. Okay, so this brings us back to this. This brings us to today and back to George Floyd's story. So, so George Floyd was someone who faced tremendous barriers, incarceration, employment discrimination, and lack of accessible and culturally adaptive addiction treatment options, and actually moved from Houston to Minneapolis to seek treatment and recovery, only to be mercilessly suffocated by police officers who were trained to view him not as a consumer of medicine, not even as a victim of drug abuse, but as President Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, Harry Anslinger had framed him as a target. And I've got a bunch of books I can recommend, and you can feel free to email me, and I'm happy to share.
All right, thank you, Dr. Clark, for sharing your time and experience with us. Those sentencing disparities that you reference continue to this day. In fact, in 2010, the Obama-era Fair Sentencing Act reduced those crack coke sentencing disparity from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1, which is an arbitrary number that's in no way informed by research. So the work continues. So thank you for your presentation. It's plain to see that the complex historical and societal forces that have shaped the war on drugs can't be given due attention in just 30 minutes, but that was a really important synopsis. At this point, we're gonna take about a 10-minute break. And then when we come back, our expert panelists will offer perspectives on how racism and the war on drugs impact recovery today. So I'll see you back here at 2 o'clock. I understand early on some folks had some issues putting things in the chat, but we've fixed that. And we'll answer those questions at the end if we have time. And if we run out of time, we'll get those questions to our panelists to respond to you via email. So now it's my privilege to introduce our panel of experts. And unfortunately, we've had a last hour change. Dr. Chatterjee is a physician, and one of his patients had a medical emergency. It's the nature of his job. So because he dedicated the time to prepare for this, I wanted to go ahead and read his bio. Dr. Avik Chatterjee is an addiction medicine physician at several shelter-based clinics through the Boston Healthcare for the Homeless program. He teaches social medicine at Harvard Medical School with an emphasis on institutional and structural racism in medicine. Sounds like a fascinating research agenda, and it's unfortunate we won't have Dr. Chatterjee with us today. But we do have, nonetheless, an esteemed panel led by Amanda Hall. Amanda Hall is a policy strategist for the Kentucky branch of the American Civil Liberties Union. Amanda is a formerly incarcerated person who is in long-term recovery. Shamika Parrish-Wright is an operations manager for the Bail Project. She's also worked as a community and voter empowerment organizer. As a child of an incarcerated parent and a formerly incarcerated person herself, she spends weekends doing art activities with families during visitation with the Special Project, a project of the Kentucky Foundation for Women. And finally, Phil Rutherford is the Chief Operating Officer at Faces and Voices of Recovery and a passionate member of the recovery community. Phil has extensive experience in substance use disorder reentry and recovery. Welcome to all of you, and thank you all for being here. And Phil, I'd like to start with you. We know that health and recovery are supported through mutual aid and fellowship. And you stated in the past, quote, "I cannot separate my Blackness from my recovery any more than I can separate my gender identity from my sexual orientation, my ability, my body size, and my socioeconomic position. I'm not 6 people, I'm 1 person. Being able to focus only on recovery is a matter of privilege." Can you say more about what you mean?
Sure. And I'd like to thank you for putting this together and having me on. And that was actually from a blog that kind of in the aftermath of what happened with George Floyd and kind of what was going on. There was a lot of discussion, at least in the national recovery world, about what our lane was and what we should do. And there was a lot of discussion about, is this part of the recovery movement? Should we be talking about this? And there's not ever really been any distinction for me, but I was trying to communicate that this notion of focusing on recovery just focusing on my recovery, just the business of not using substances and kind of getting on with my life. That's a wonderful sentiment to have if that's an option. But to put it bluntly, I'm Black everywhere I go. So walking into a room of, my pathway is 12-step recovery. I am a person in recovery. I didn't say that to start, but walking into a 12-step room and being told, hey, I understand that you got all that Black stuff and all that, you got some jail stuff and all that other stuff. Leave all that out there. Let's just focus on recovery. That never really sat right with me. And so I can't separate those things. And I understand in the 12-step community, there's a concept of singleness of purpose and that there's only that focus on the common problem. But it's impossible to separate those things. And the ability to walk in a room and say, I'm only going to focus on this one thing is privilege. That is the definition of privilege, to be able to say, I don't have to have those other things affect me. And that's kind of what the content of the blog was about.
And since you can't separate your race from all of your other identities, can you talk about some of the challenges you faced as a man who's both Black and in recovery?
Sure. I'm also a fat person, right? So being, I'm not trying to make light of it, but it's just one of those things, right? So like you walk around with all of these identities, and we don't have time to dig into intersectionality, but the nature of who I am and trying to find recovery, especially so today in recovery world, there are a lot of options, right? I live in Rochester, Minnesota. Even in small town Rochester, Minnesota, there's 12-step, there's faith-based, there's secular recovery, there's 15 different things that a person can find. But when at the time that I was seeking recovery, there was church and AA, and church and 12-step. And so those were the 2 pathways. And while I felt marginally comfortable in the church, because I was raised there, I grew up in the South, and in the South, not to play a stereotype, but if you're Black and in the South, you're going to church. So I felt at home there. But there was a lot of stigma and misunderstanding about the illness. And then I walked into the 12-step community, and there was a lot of stigma and misunderstanding about my Blackness. So the challenges that I faced as a Black person in recovery were that in the place where I felt most at home, which is the faith community, there wasn't a lot of understanding of the illness. And in the place where there was a lot of understanding of the illness, there wasn't a lot of sort of awareness or understanding of my Blackness. Now, as luck would have it, and I believe it was Dr. Clark earlier spoke about George Floyd, I moved to Minnesota. And in addition to Minnesota being the land of 10,000 lakes, it's also the land of 10,000 treatment centers. And I found recovery up here, but after leaving a treatment engagement up here, I discovered a 12-step community of people of color. and it helped me to kind of get over some of those barriers, and then I was able to find my way. But that is rare. I know plenty of people that have not been able to find that comfortable space.
Thank you. Shamika, I want to turn to you. According to the Drug Policy Alliance, people of color are more likely to be stopped, searched, arrested, convicted, and harshly sentenced for drug law violations. Nearly 80% of people in federal prisons and 60% of people in state prisons for drug offenses are Black or Latino, despite similar rates of use across race. Can you explain the toll that incarceration can take on a person and their family from your personal and professional experience?
Thank you, Alex. How much time do we have? I feel like Phil, there's so much intersectionality. I was listening to Shelton and hearing the similarities, even though I'm not a person who's dealing with the form of recovery from drugs and alcohol. I always tell people that I'll always be dealing with some form of recovery because of poverty. I grew up very poor, and the impacts of poverty impacted my parents' decisions, impacts my decisions to this day as I focus on thriving and instead of moving from surviving to thriving. And I think that that's something that anybody that's dealing with recovery deals with. I do want to say thank you for this opportunity. Being a voice of hope to me is important, and the work is important that you all are doing, because I believe that any type of spirit or force or goodness moves through people. And so having people with direct lived experiences, being able to share, to me, it helps people connect, because somebody at home is dealing with some issue, and there's not a book for everything that we need. And sometimes you just need people who've been there, done that, and got the t-shirt. So I appreciate that. So thinking about, like Shelton and so many others, I grew up during the war on drugs. I am the only daughter of a father who spent 40 of his 56 years in and out of jail due to drugs and alcohol and poverty. Drug use and abuse has run rampant in my family, like so many others, for years and many, many years. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, but in the early 80s, I saw my mother's family dying from heroin abuse, from AIDS, and other issues related to alcoholism. So I was never a stranger to any of those things, just seeing people deal with that, losing 4 boyfriends who sold drugs to being robbed and killed. I've seen it from so many angles. And because I saw so many adults giving in, is what I thought it was, just giving in to drugs, I saw that as a weakness and swore that I would never do that. I would never put myself in that situation. I didn't see the social problems connected to it. I didn't see the disproportionate sentencing. I didn't see the arrest. I was a young girl who saw that her father and his brothers and all the Black men in her life were either going to jail or they were dying in the streets due to drugs and alcohol and poverty. And so it made me very angry. I was very angry growing up, because I thought it was just a choice, right? Just choose to do better, just choose to be better. And my father used to write me from jail all the time and say, you know what, you think you have so much control, but wait till you don't have control. You won't know what to do. And so I appreciate my father. Those communications from jail really helped steer me. He didn't want me to make the same mistakes. He was street savvy. He wanted me to be book and street smart. He wanted to be his son and daughter at the same time. And so he instilled so much of these values that he picked up along the way, because he didn't want me to go to jail. But I went to jail in 1995 at 18, but not for drugs and alcohol, fighting myself out of a domestic situation where I was engaged to a son of a sheriff for 29 years. And I fought back and I picked up a weapon. And when the police came, I had never been arrested. So I just wrote down everything that I did and said, you know, he put his hands on me, and I wasn't having that. And found myself in front of a judge. Well, first I found myself in jail for 38 days. 38 days on $1,000 bond, which was 10% of 10,000, which it could have been, like Shelton said, it could have been $500. It was not enough. It was too much for my family to do anything about. It was too much for me. And then I found myself now being a parent that's incarcerated. I found myself praying to God that I would never be in this situation again if God got me out of this situation. I found myself wondering, how did I get here? How did this happen? I was just defending myself. I was reacting to my environment. I found myself saying some of the same things my father used to say to me in his letters when I would say, why are you in jail again? Why are you in prison again? And then I found myself dealing with the disproportionate sentencing that we've been speaking about, and all of those things, and being offered a plea deal because my public defender said I was facing 8 to 15 years because I used a knife and a hammer. And I found myself saying in front of this judge, where I got my ex-fiance to come and let the judge know, hey, he put his hands on me. He did all these things. He ripped the phone out of the wall. Why am I here? I shouldn't be here. He's admitting it. He got charged with domestic violence. Why am I here with charged with felonious assault? And the judge looked at him, not even me, and said, I don't care. She had no reason to do what she did. So at that point, I was just this poor Black girl who was in a bad relationship, but nobody cared about. I had a three-year-old daughter at home. Nobody cared that I was on my way to college. Nobody cared that I lost my job, that I was about to lose my house in the housing projects. They just saw me standing there, and I had committed a violent offense. And so this mission that I went on in my life early on to say, I'll never be on drugs and I'll never do this and I'll never be in jail, never was here. And I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to give up. My father was distraught. He was in prison and on his way out, and he couldn't be there to protect me. And I was angry at my father because I said to him, if you were around, if he knew I had you, he wouldn't have done those things to me. And I found myself blaming him and not understanding all the circumstances he experienced. He got out of prison during the 90s, where drugs were just crazy. And people offered him crack, and then he became addicted to crack. And then I watched my father just try to navigate that and go through the 12-step programs, and he can recite all the sayings backwards and forwards. And it wasn't enough. Every time he went to prison, he came home to the same environment, and that environment wasn't conducive for his recovery. And he would constantly let me know that. And so I said, well, I don't know what to do. You can live with me. That didn't work out long. And then we both came to a point that, one, he did not want to see me locked back up, and I didn't want to see him locked back up. And he said, I want to be to my grandchildren what I couldn't be to you. And I will say that the last 10 years of his life, he died in 2015. He was able to be out and hold his own apartment, and I hated that apartment, and I actually think it contributed to his death. But he held on to that, and he still lived in the one room like he lived in a cell. Everything was in that front room. So the institutionalized, seeing all of those things up close and personal, it made me not want to have to deal with that, but it didn't protect me from ever seeing that. And that's what we see families dealing with. We do our work with the Bail Project because we want to interrupt that system. We want to level the playing field. We know that the judicial system has so many baked in injustices, and that when somebody is held pre-trial, by day 3, their life is falling apart. They might not have the same job. They might not have custody of their children. They might not be able to go and keep their bed at a treatment center. And these decisions that people are making to accept 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, and to take these plea deals make it worse for everyone. The whole community is impacted. The whole family is impacted. And so my work with the Special Project, really all of my work around prisoners' rights, everything that I've done has really been me as that little girl with these adverse childhood experiences, fighting to make a different world for the kids that I created, and making sure that people have an opportunity to learn and be willing to learn and grow and understand that addiction comes in many forms, and that we have so many issues in our society that intersect, as Phil mentioned, because I also have to be a Black woman. I'm also a bigger Black woman. I definitely, when he said that, it resonated, because when you walk into a space, you're all the things, and you're all the things all the time. So being a Black person, meaning that any space you go into, even in treatment, you got to be the hardest working person in the room, because you know that all eyes are on you. And then when I married my husband, he had just completed the 12-step program. So I also found myself in relationships with people who were similar to my father, right? So I needed a lot of understanding, and it was through participating in Al-Anon and also getting some therapy myself, that I came to understand that I realized that I did have issues with control, and I thought that I can create a better life. But trying to create a better life and live that life and not have a society that can help you perpetuate that it's hard. It's hard. It's very, very hard work. And so we, through our social justice work, create communities where we can learn to thrive, and we're not just focused on surviving. So that would be my personal and professional experience wrapped up in one, just continuing to fight and be a cycle breaker, breaking the cycles of my family, breaking the cycles of poverty. And I know that it can take generations, but using education, using my work experience to move that needle every day. And I already see a difference in the 6 children that I've given birth to. And I know that that work continues to go on and really be the voice of hope that we talk about.
Thank you. Amanda, I'm going to turn to you now. Drug courts are an alternative to incarceration, but people of color are less likely to be referred to drug court, and they're less likely to succeed and graduate from drug court. Can you talk about why that might be?
Yeah, sure. And I just want to echo what my other panelists said, and thank you so much to the Voices of Hope for putting on this event. And I am a person in long-term recovery, and I am a person who is formerly incarcerated. And I am a person, and there may be, I'm just saying this, or there may be some folks on this call or watching this right now that was raised in a household, though it may have been good intent, but of color blindness, you know, to don't talk about race, to see everyone as equal. I'm from a very white community in Eastern Kentucky, very, very predominantly white. And actually recovery is where I was really exposed to and saw the racial inequities. You know, I didn't learn about them in school. That's just the truth. I mean, Shelton pointed to it. So if you're some white folks on here right now, learn with me, continue to learn. When you see it, call it out, continue to fight and be an ally. But when we talk about drug courts, there's something else that we're in everything. We see racial disparities. We see systems that racism has built. You know, in Kentucky, we're number 7 in the nation for rates of incarceration. We're also number 3 in the nation for women that are incarcerated. Number 2 for children who experience parental incarceration, and number 1 for kids who live with someone other than their biological parent. Now, I told you all those horrible stats, and now within every one of those, I want you to know that Black people suffer the worst in every one of those. And when Phil talked about that singleness of purpose, because I do 12-step meetings as well, that fellowship, when I think about singleness of purpose, I think about wanting others to recover. And when I see those stats and I know those stats, I have to say something. I have to point out that racism, have to fight. How do we make recovery more equitable? How do we work on these issues? So when it comes to drug court, I think we have to look at our history. We have to look at communities that are over-policed and overcharged. You know, Black folks are less likely to get that plea bargain or have their charges, or, you know, a plea bargain to amend their charges down. I should say they get plea bargains, but I'm talking about amending charges down. They're over criminalized. You know, even I think, you know, I'm really sad that the doctor wasn't allowed, able to attend, because I was really looking forward to that, because we see these racial disparities in health outcomes everywhere. So I think it's something we have to talk about. Our court officials, folks that work in drug court. We have to talk about our treatment providers and treatment centers, really understanding racial bias, implicit or explicit. Like, we have to have these hard systemic conversations. They can't be led by someone like me. Like I said, I am learning. If you are learning with me, even though I've read books and research, it's just not the same as that lived experience. And we have to know that. So we should really be participating, but not leading those conversations. So I think the over-policing increases the fact and the stacking charges on black folks, them being seen as criminals as opposed to someone with a substance use disorder issue or needing help. I think that goes into it. I think even when someone gets placed in the justice system, you know, for example, when Shelton talked, I had my boys listen because their mom, I was in the same prison that Shelton's mom was in. But when I got done with prison, I went to a treatment center, which saved my life and saved my boys' lives. And we had to have that conversation. Shelton didn't get that, and why, and we had to. But anyway, with the, you know, we have to look at that too with drug court, and we have to have those hard conversations. We have to look at those aspects, you know, the overcharging, the policing when people are incarcerated. Is a Black individual getting more write-ups in jails and prisons? You know, often that will prevent people, when it comes to receiving various treatments, from being eligible for some programs when they see the parole board, or even if you're on probation, what the judge thinks of those infractions. So there's a whole bunch of reasons Black folks don't get into drug court, and I think we need to call them out, and we can work on them as a community. And then, you know, not graduating drug court. I think, you know, Phil and Shamika, just thank you all, and Shelton and everyone that's put, I mean, I can't imagine the emotional labor. But when Phil talked about those specific communities of color, recovery communities of color, and what those meant, I just wonder, all around the nation, but in states in Kentucky, how well are we doing that? You know, and how would it be to be in a drug court and have that trauma? You know, that's a place you can identify, talk about, work on some trauma, but you don't talk about racial trauma. I mean, my goodness, the impact of racism. So I could absolutely see that. How hard would that be to complete that program, and then to live with that trauma of you might go to jail if you mess up for a mental health issue. You know, there's just so many overwhelming factors that really prevents Black folks from benefiting from systems that are alternatives to incarceration.
Thank you. Phil, turning back to you, as a part of SAMHSA's working principles of recovery, they suggest that recovery should be culturally competent. So I'm wondering about cultural competence when it comes to, for instance, 12-step programs in marginalized communities. We got you muted, Phil. Yep.
That is the catchphrase of 2020, I guess now 2021, which is you're on mute or you're muted. So in the spirit of full disclosure, like I said, I found my recovery pathway in 12-step, however, there's a good bit of evidence that specifically in marginalized groups. So if you understand the sort of the ethos of 12-step, the concept is this admission of personal powerlessness, right? That I come in and I discover that I'm personally powerless. And through that, there is this catharsis that moves me through a process of spiritual growth. And that's a wonderful thing. And that works particularly well if that is the main problem. So when I say there's considerable evidence, I've been doing some reading recently about, you know, the population of 12-step is overwhelmingly white, and there's been not a lot in the big picture research, but there has been research around why there is this disparity of people of color in 12-step, And one of the hypotheses is that if you have people that have experienced marginalization for a good portion of their life, and you put them in a room and you say, listen, you're the problem, no kidding, right? Like there's this sort of there's this internalization of marginalization or internalized oppression. Yeah, I know I'm the problem. Everyone in my life since the time I was born has been telling me I'm the problem. So you're just another guy telling me I'm the problem. I'm not going to sit here and listen to that, especially if I have any way of not doing that, right? So, and the thing is, it's not that, and I'm not trying to cast the 12-step pathway as bad, but it works well if you've got someone with some socioeconomic status and some privilege, and they're on this journey, and then they discover, okay, maybe I don't call the shots, and maybe I do need to take a step back and learn some humility. That makes perfect sense. But for lack of a better term, when someone's had their ass kicked their whole life, and then you put them down and sit them in a chair and say, you're bad, you didn't do it, or you didn't do it right, there's not that that catharsis is not the same, I guess is the best way I can say it. So that's one thing. And I think specifically, there are groups springing up over the past year or so that are kind of doing it a little bit differently. And I think, just again, as a 12-stepper, I think Bill Wilson would be proud of that. I think there are groups that are kind of sort of along the lines of personal empowerment and personal growth. There are groups that are sort of spin-offs of AA and NA that are a little bit more strengths-based and focusing on lifting people up. So I'll get off the soapbox, but I think that's important to think about as we talk about sending people on pathways to recovery. Not everywhere has all of these multiple pathways. In some places, it's still 12-step or church, which you know, kind of like the Blues Brothers movie where they go into the bar and they say, what kind of music do you have? And they say, we got both, country and Western, right? Like we're consistently sending people to pathways that are not culturally responsive to them and then blaming them when it doesn't work. And I think that has to stop.
Great answer. Thank you. Shamika, I'm going to turn back to you. On any given night in the United States, there are 500,000 people sitting in jail before trial simply because they can't afford bail. The pretrial population is disproportionately Black and Latino and has doubled over the past 15 years. Can you talk more about how our cash bail system negatively impacts people of color?
Well, it goes with what Shelton spoke about earlier about being incarcerated with a bail that he could not afford, what I spoke about, and what we continue to see is that we know if we're 8% of the population, then to have so many of us incarcerated on low-level offenses is itself a travesty. What happened before we got there? Particular information around the Bail Project and how we started and what we were thinking about in the beginning is always on bailproject.org. So if I missed something, I encourage folks to go there because it tells the history and the story. Well, we know that even in a place like Kentucky, where we were progressive to outlaw bail bondsmen, that did not stop the cash bail system from keeping people in jail simply because they're poor. We have a pay-as-you-go system. That means that, as Phil was talking about, if someone, we recently had a state rep who allegedly had strangled his wife and had got a $25,000 bail and was out. We have someone we bailed out. She was accused of stealing a can of baby formula, and she had a $500 bail that she couldn't afford. Well, logic tells you that if she was accused of stealing a $30 can of formula, then she probably didn't have $500 as well. And so her baby was 6 weeks old and staying with an elderly neighbor while she was incarcerated. So we were able to get her out, but it just shows that it's really about the money. A judge has made the decision that you can go home, but that decision, when bail was set up, it was meant to be an incentive to come back to court and never punitive. But now we know that it's used in a punitive way and it makes people plead. And when I say it makes them plead, that means they're accepting incarceration sentences. They throw those years out like it's candy. It's no regard to their life. And if you poll many of the alleged victims, they don't want people to die in jail, because the longer you sit in jail, with COVID-19 being rampant the way it is, you literally can get COVID because you got a traffic offense and die. And that's not what it's set up for. Even people like myself who've been on every side of justice, of the justice table, every side, I've been incarcerated, I've been a victim. Even in my situations, I didn't want that person to die. I just wanted them out of my life and to never come around again. So we know that they're saying that we want people to have their day in court. When people are held that way, you don't even want to fight. You just want to give up and you want to get out. And so when you have Black and brown men whose bails are in held in comparison to white men are much higher on a given day. And it's not just with white judges, it's also with some Black judges as well. When judges are worried about a media blowout. And so sometimes these bails are set on what might happen, not necessarily our state pretrial system, which already has many baked in injustices. If you live in certain zip codes and things like that, then your score changes. If you've been just as involved before, then you might have a higher ranking, and those rankings recently changed. So we see our work as necessary. I take jobs with campaigns and projects and positions to work myself out of a job. When we started in 2018, it was Shelton who connected me to this work. And when I got here, I just was immediately reminded that I remember being held and literally no other reason. And we see people with drug offenses who are treated worse than somebody charged with a violent offense. We see people whose bails are set high, and all of those things cause people to make terrible decisions. It caused them to give up hope. And then it continues to just to lay a heavy burden on our city government and our budget as well. $83 a day with an average stay of 23 days. We have invested nearly $9 million to get almost 3,000 people out pre-trial right here in Jefferson County and the surround in 10 other counties in Kentucky. We are a high incarceration state. Amanda already told you, with women, with children who have a parent that's impacted by incarceration, our numbers continue to grow, so much so that the Vera Justice Institute had that report that said within 100 years, we all will be incarcerated. So we know that before 100 years, at the rate that we're going, a great deal of Black and brown and poor people will be incarcerated as well. So our cash bail system is negative because it impacts people of color, Black, especially our Black men, disproportionately. It forces them to take plea deals, it increases people going to prison. We've seen 93% of our clients do not go on to prison. We know that that's the number I can sleep with at night, knowing that getting people out pre-trial increases their chances to have a better outcome in our judicial system that has baked in injustices that we all recognize. From our elected officials to our judges, even our prosecutors, we all recognize that there are baked in injustices, and we still won't do away with this pre-trial ranking system, which we call RATs. Risk assessment tools are built, they're too biased. And so if I'm having a bad night and you pick me up from my mom's house and I'm arguing and I need to sleep it off and I miss the pretrial interview, then my score can be anything. And they're basing it on something I might have did 8 years ago if I was locked up before. And so it's too many issues and errors, but because we want to be Kentucky proud about something, we refuse to let it go. And so the refusal to let that go and to build it on a needs-based system, it fuels our work that we have to do on the ground, getting people out, giving them a better way. Just like I was in that front of that judge with an orange jumpsuit on, and my fiance was there in a suit, that judge never looked me in my face. He only looked at my fiance, who was there for me. And so we know that you fare better when you're outside and you're able to come in and defend yourself. Now, with people who are locked up for situations around drug abuse, they're labeled and sometimes they're put in detox. So sometimes we can't even go and get them out within the 5 to 7 days they're forced to do detox in there. So jails, our local jails, are becoming the biggest detox place. And that doesn't mean that people won't get out and get back into use. And we've seen that happen. It's better to fund the things that work, to give the programs that are working on the outside, to give alternatives to holding somebody pretrial and alternative sentencing. And like Amanda spoke to give those opportunities to more people and not just young white people. A young white woman fares better in getting out of jail than a black woman, than a white male. They get out even with multiple drug charges, and they get accepted into more treatment centers. So we are trying to level the playing field with our work, and I encourage people to visit bailproject.org to learn more. But this war on drugs, it has so many negative impacts, and that pretrial incarceration, it is through the roof. And we see bails of more than 500. We just recently in Cincinnati, we paid a bail for a man for $79, and he was in there for a week. And so we got to understand that people's lives are impacted, and when they're held, it creates more hopelessness.
Well, you said it, Shamika, that the war on drugs creates so many negative impacts that it's impossible for us to count them here. But one of them that I want to talk about is civil asset forfeiture. And I'll offer this to any of the three of you that would care to respond, or all three of you can. According to the Drug Policy Alliance, civil asset forfeiture allows the government to seize cash, cars, real estate, or other property suspected of being connected to criminal activity, even if the owner is never actually arrested for a crime. In fact, in a staggering 80% of civil asset forfeitures, criminal charges are never even filed against property owners. Civil asset forfeiture was rarely used prior to the war on drugs, but it's rapidly expanded since the 1970s, and it disproportionately impacts communities of color. Do any of you, the three of you, whoever would care to, talk about the negative impacts of civil asset forfeiture?
Well, let me see. This shirt that I'm wearing is for Breonna Taylor. When I first heard about her case in March, I was flying back from LA, from our offices in LA. And when I got back, the way it was presented to us was that a warrant served situation went bad. The first thing I said is, whoa, who shot at a police officer? Then the next thing was, I know they weren't Black because they would be dead or in jail. And then when we started getting more news, and the FOP were so upset that Judge Ulu Stevens released Kenneth Walker, I said, there is no way in hell a Black man accused of shooting at the police during a warrant situation is released with no bail. I said, something is not right. And now this is when my survival kicks in, and I said, they went there to rob them. That's exactly what I said. Because in the streets, when people's houses get kicked in, nobody goes to jail, you see them coming out with stuff, you never see them get that stuff back, then you know the whole purpose was to get whatever it was in their apartment. But they seriously screwed up. And I'm glad that you brought this up. When I saw this question, I said, whoa, it's true. It's the very reason why Breonna Taylor is not with us right now. It means that what we're saying, that even if there was no drugs in her house, there was no money in there, but we're saying that if there was drugs in the house, the police get to be judge, jury, and executioner. That is horrible. It's not the best representation of our Constitution or anything. It means that we have no rights. If I'm around drugs, we have no rights. It means that even in our questioning process, when we're talking and interviewing clients for the Bail Project, we say to them, when you're released, if you don't know what's in a person's car, do not get a ride with them, because we literally had someone we worked months to pay to get them out. They got released from jail. Some guys they knew were riding down the street. They said, oh, can you give me a ride home? Gave him a ride home, pulled over in the next block. He's back in jail because somebody in that car had drugs, or I don't know what they had. But the fact is that we are letting drugs and the police run our very freedom that we're supposed to have. In your home, you're supposed to be safe. So these no-knock warrants that was executed at 1 a.m. to a working woman's home, and they didn't have enough intel to know that she had a person there who was concealed and carried, who had every right to protect his home and their home. That tells you that they were just looking for a reason to get in there. A classic girlfriend case, a girlfriend of the drug dealer, and you go in there and you take everything, and they never see those things again. There are Black men, brown men, all kinds of people fighting to get their stuff back to this day that was taken many years ago. It's a legal way to rob people. And so much so I've heard that the Supreme Court has stepped in, but that the recent ruling isn't strong enough to protect people like you and I. It was some technicalities that they're finding around it. It is a horrible process. It leads to them validating these no-knock warrants, which are killing our people, not just in Kentucky, not just in Louisville, all over, and it's traumatizing the children too. These no-knock warrants, they come in, they don't care if your child is down there eating cereal on the floor, they put guns to their head. And you're telling me that whatever you think you're going to find or is more important than the lives that you're impacting as soon as you're breaking their door with these no-knock warrants. So that's why I wore this shirt today, because when I saw that question, I said, that is the reason why we're out here for the Breonna Taylor movement, is because any of us, if we don't do something about this, it can happen to any of us at any given time.
Bill or Amanda, will either of you care to comment on that?
Sure, I will. So civil asset forfeiture is something that the ACLU, we have worked on for a very long time. We would want to do away with civil asset forfeiture altogether. In the state of Kentucky, you know, we have some statutes in law that says that law enforcement agencies are supposed to report what they seize. So in 2018, out of 323 agencies, 11% reported it. And that was $17.5 million worth of goods. So imagine how much is seized. And like you said, Alex, you don't even have to be convicted of a crime. But what happens when this stuff is seized, if it isn't in criminal court, you'll have to go through a civil process to get your stuff back. If they seize $3,000 worth of your whatever, money, your possessions, I mean, it can be anything. And then you have to pay, because in civil court, you know, in criminal court, we have public defenders who they're all overworked, our poor public defenders. But in civil court, you don't even have that right to have that indigency and have someone to represent you. So law enforcement, like, they know if something's been seized, that's $3,000. Sorry, my cat had something to say. And it's gonna cost you thousands of dollars to get a lawyer, to go through all these proceedings. People just give up. And this money isn't, there's no clear reporting of what's going on with it. You know, and this is an issue. You know, the ACLU is a nonpartisan organization. We literally work on policy. So this is, there's been bills introduced in past sessions here in Kentucky to do better with reporting as a starting point. Like I said, we want to get rid of civil asset forfeiture, but that is such a big point. That has been introduced by Republicans, Democrats, and they always fail in the Kentucky General Assembly. So I really encourage folks, you have to think about how this drives the war on drugs. Just think about it. If you have jurisdictions that are operated, you know, they get a lot of their operating costs from seized property. I mean, civil asset forfeiture is way more of an issue than I think folks know about, or that we talk about. And that money is usually put back into more law enforcement, as opposed to, you know, and we have these communities who need so many resources when it comes to mental health and substance use disorder resources. Our Black communities are very poor rural communities, but yet we have this thriving, yes, get rid of civil asset forfeiture. That's what we need to do.
Yep. And if I could just, I'll make it quick, but I just want to add, behind all of this, there are two, if you kind of get into systems thinking, there are two very systemic problems here. One is the, you know, specifically in the Black community, the devaluation of Black bodies and Black safety, the idea that you can just kick in a door and run into a house and take whatever you want. That is part of systemic racism and systemic oppression, that the thought that you have the right to do that, law enforcement or not, is a problem. And then the other systemic problem is the position of law enforcement as judge, jury, executioner, mental health professional, emergency worker, first responder, teacher, you know, academic advisor, like all the fact that all of these things, and I'm not trying to make a negative statement about law enforcement. I am saying that we have all of these tasks that have been shifted onto law enforcement. There is a systemic problem there that that is sort of playing itself out. And until such time as we deal with both of those problems, we will continue to have the effects of both of those problems, right? So like if you, I don't know, if you don't get a vaccine shot, you probably will keep having the sickness that you need the vaccine shot for, right? And we can make motion, and we should make motion to eliminate practices that are harmful, but until we start digging at the root of those problems, they'll just pop up in other ways. So if we ban civil forfeiture, there will be some clever law enforcement group that figures out a way to get around that and do the same thing, because the problem isn't forfeiture. The problem is Black bodies don't matter. Black lives don't matter. We can go and take what we need to in this war on whatever the current, insert whatever the thing is that we're warring against. So I believe that we need to work on the extremities, but we also need to work at the core of the problem.
That's actually an important transition for us to make, because I want to think about looking ahead, looking forward, looking towards progress, but also to the ways, as you've suggested, Phil, that these systemic issues are just reinvented and kind of reimagined. So and this is a question I'll open to all of you as well. In 2014, Baltimore decriminalized possession of marijuana. And yet between 2015 and 2017, there were 1,514 individuals arrested for marijuana possession, and 1,450 of them were Black. That's 96%. And so often decriminalization and legalization are billed as progressive alternatives to the war on drugs. So my question for you all is, what lessons should we glean from the early experiments in decriminalization and legalization, and what are those implications for social justice?
Let me jump in. It's a lot to think about. I mean, it's how I know that I'm becoming numb to these numbers is because I'm not surprised, right? I'm not surprised to see that, because also criminalizing them or letting them be convicted means that if they wanted to make a career in it, if they wanted to open a dispensary, because they have these kind of charges, they won't be able to. And that's what we're dealing with. Even as we talk about legalization, who qualifies to be able to actually get those dispensaries is directly connected to our criminal justice system. So one thing means, like Phil is saying, even if we outlaw these civil forfeitures, they'll find a way to work behind it. So I think it's our job to have elected officials, and I'm not just saying that because I'm running for mayor. That's what I do if I'm not even running, is that we have to have elected officials that are going to bring the people's agenda to these areas and make sure that we specifically have language, because language is everything. I read the police contract, and oh my goodness, they are covered. And I'm like Phil, I'm not saying that, I know that there's police officers that wake up and do the right thing, but there's too many that aren't, and they're protected, and they're well protected through their contract. Who's contracting for the people? Who's contracting to make sure that I get my things back from a civil forfeiture and I'm poor and I just lost everything that matters to me? Who's contracting that in? Who's making sure that that language is inclusive of all of the people that are really impacted by it? The thing with this federal legislation, it might not hit our doors the same way, right? Because if I'm not in a particular given situation, that has nothing to do when LMPD comes in here and take my stuff, right? And so we need the local legislation, local policies, local ordinances that protect us. And we have to have elected officials that are willing to go against the grain. Yeah, you might not get a certain endorsement, but what you get is support and trust from the people who know that you're going to bring the right agenda. We're not being brought to the table. Right now, land and property, and I've said that as we organized that in Justice Square, when we took over Jefferson Square Park and named it Injustice Square, that was intentional. But when they come down, when they're worried about, say, the announcement from Daniel Cameron, when they were worried about that, guess what they did? They put fences around all the buildings. They added extra boarding and plywood and all of that stuff. And I said to the people in that square, I said, you see, what they protect is what they care about. They don't care about our bodies being right here in the street. We care about our city. They don't care about that. They protect and board up what they want. So we have to show that, yes, we are the land of the beautiful and the land of the free, but my body is important too. Not just the land, not just my property, my body is important. And because you can't make money off of me like you did in slavery, doesn't mean that I don't matter anymore. It doesn't mean that Black people don't matter anymore, or brown people, or anybody that is struggling and to survive and is poor. You are told by our systems in so many ways that it doesn't matter, right? Because if you don't own enough land, you don't matter. And so the police operate in that way. Their first duty, it looks like, is to protect the land and the property and not the people. And that's why they can do like Phil said, and come in your home and do those things, because you don't matter. So we can change things, and I'm definitely hopeful, and I definitely am going to be behind. It's a new era, and I've been saying this from day one, from the protests. We can never go back to business as usual. We will never be the same. Our young people are not going to let that happen. They're not accepting it, and they're willing to die to show that. So, and some of these young people belong to some of these elite people. This is their daughters and this is their sons who are coming down with us and saying, this is not right. Young people get it in way more ways than one. So the status quo need to be worried. They need to be really worried, because change is coming. But it starts with us motivating the right people to run and to keep the agenda for the people when they get in office.
Yeah, and I would just, the marijuana conversation, I think this echoes back to Phil and what he said earlier, which is so true. That's why I want to transform the whole landscape, is I don't know how else to get us out of all of this and root racism. Because even with the states that have, you know, passed these marijuana laws, we see from 2015 to 2018, there was actually 100,000 more marijuana arrests nationally after all this reform happened. So we also see that in 2018, 43% of all the drug arrests nationally was for marijuana. That's more than for violent crimes. So it seems like these laws passed, and like Phil, you know, like there was like this, the enforcement actually got more intense as opposed to, so to really, a way to start is to actually make sure that it is completely legalized in every single state. And then folks' records are cleared. The money that is saved should not, with the number of people that had been incarcerated or on supervision, that money should go into communities that were devastated. We cannot continue to prop up and build, and it isn't an attack on law enforcement for me either, but like Phil said, we can't continue to build up law enforcement, because that's what, you know, in Kentucky, we spend more on incarcerating people than we do higher education. And that's wild. And then we see the racial disparities in marijuana. You know, you're 3 times more likely if you're Black to be arrested for it, but in Kentucky, you're 9 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana in the state of Kentucky. So I think that with any of these bills, and Phil said it so eloquently, because it's so true. I mean, it will just morph into a different way, which is my constant learning as well. I think about a bill that we have this year, a recovery readiness community bill, which is a good bill. It's to make sure there's treatment and folks are working together. We do not have in that bill a component about racial equity. This is a real good opportunity to put that in there and make sure on the front end that we're checking that stuff, that we're making sure these recovery ready communities are equitable. When we talk about these issues and we want to learn from history, we have to actually do it. We have to actually actively, if laws were written in a way that they disproportionately impacted Black folks, like we have to actively fight against that going forward, because we know what the systems look like that they operate in.
I want to conclude our panel with a question for you, Phil, that I think will launch us into our next presentation. In another blog entry, this is our lane, you said we can't pick recovery justice outside of social justice because recovery justice is social justice. Can you talk more about that?
Okay, so Yeah, again, another just a blog response to. I'm not like a prolific blog person. I tend to write in response to stuff, but there was a situation that cropped up where we were taken to the woodshed, my organization, and there was something I wasn't a part of, and there was a panel. It was going to be about COVID, and there were no people of color on the panel. And someone got a hold of and I don't even think we had announced it. We were just kind of talking about it. Someone got a hold of the flyer for it and took us to the woodshed for not, and the sentiment was, how dare you talk about something that is disproportionately affecting the Black community without a Black face on the panel. And and to which I said, oh, yep, okay, that's apt criticism. And that sparked a whole debate within a lot of the again, kind of the national organizations that promote recovery. And there was a sentiment in some of those groups that we needed people, you need to stay in your lane, focus on recovery. Again, some more of that singleness of purpose message. And I was in one of these conversations with a group of people, and I kept hearing this thing. I kept hearing it be about, well, this is about the person that made the issue. You know how stuff works on social media. One person makes a complaint, then everybody else kind of piles on. And what I was hearing was people saying this person's critique or criticism was not valid, and we didn't really need to listen to that because it was his personal issue. And the fact of the matter is, what we were doing was saying his voice, he didn't need to be at the table. And it clicked in my head. Like, and first of all, I was opposed to that, but I was just kind of listening. But it clicked to me that we were doing the exact same thing that people in recovery, 20 years ago, when recovery community organizations were just kind of coming on the scene, and people were actually standing up and advocating specifically for recovery, one of the main complaints is, how dare you have a conversation about recovery without anyone who has lived experience in recovery in the room? That was the argument, right? But in that meeting, what I heard were people saying, how dare this person raise their voice in a room to talk about a thing that they have lived experience in. And it was just kind of this, speaking of catharsis, it was kind of this moment where I was like, well, of course, it's the same thing. It's the same argument. We don't get to on one hand say you got to have recovery people at the table if you're going to talk about anything having to do with recovery, and that's social justice. You don't get to say that and then silence other people that are trying to do the exact same thing. You can't. That, at least I can't abide that, right? And that was kind of the position I took, and my organization. We started on a path of making sure, and we use the NEKC Racial Equity Toolkit, which if you're not familiar with that, I highly recommend you look it up. It is a methodology for an organization to kind of examine every single facet of policy that they have, and see if the right people are at the table, and see if they're truly being inclusive. And as a result, and unfortunately I have to leave in just a second, I'll make this quick. As a result, our legislative policies this year, like we've been around 20 years, our legislative policies this year, for the first time, now include specific policy agenda targeted at Black and Indigenous people of color. And that's, we never had that before. And I don't think it's because anyone was like, hey, we're going to try and hold Black people down. It wasn't that. It was this sort of colorblindness or lack of awareness, or that's not our lane mentality. But because of those events, now it's written in our policy. And as we advocate to the federal government for actual dollars and cents programs, it's part of our advocacy work. And I think that's where the shift needs to happen. So that is all.
Well, the title of your blog post, "This is Our Lane," I think is a perfect place to leave this conversation and conclude the panel. So thank you all so much. Just want to offer our sincere thanks for your time and experience. And we're going to move to our final segment. So we've talked about how racism and the war on drugs are barriers to recovery. Now we're going to hear, as Phil had suggested, how anti-racism activism is recovery advocacy and how we can all be a part of the solution. So to give us that perspective is my friend and colleague, Jeremy Byard. Jeremy is a formerly incarcerated person who is in long-term recovery. He's a co-founder and director of the Louisville Recovery Community Connection and a leader in the U.S. recovery advocacy movement. Jeremy, thanks for being here. You can take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Alex. I'm glad to be here, and thank you to Voices of Hope and all the sponsors of this town hall, and thank you to all of the presenters and panelists that came before me. This has been such a powerful couple of hours, and I'm just honored to be in the presence of all this. So I'm going to share my screen here and dive in. There we go. Awesome. So we're going to dive into what it looks like, and specifically what it looks like for recovery community organizations to move toward anti-racist recovery advocacy. And although you may not be a recovery community organization, I hope to inspire you to do internal and personal work toward an anti-racist advocacy with inside yourself and with inside your organizations, whatever that looks like for you. And in America right now, we are in the midst of a public health crisis and an epidemic. And no, I'm not talking about COVID-19 or any of the new strands that are coming from Brazil or the UK. And I'm not talking about the opioid epidemic. What I'm talking about and what we're going to talk about today is racism and systemic racism, and how it has plagued our country, our communities, and individuals in the recovery community for years, for decades, and for centuries. See, the alarm bell has been going off for those same years and decades and centuries. In America, and specifically white America, we have been hitting the snooze button over and over and over again. And each generation, we have these awakening moments, and we make a little bit of strides, moving in the right direction, and we rest on our laurels, and we fall asleep again. And so the question I might pose to you to think about is, what is it going to take for us to keep moving forward and not fall asleep again? And so today, we are going to look at understanding some key terms and concepts. We're going to learn about the impact of the war on drugs, and we'll draw some connections between racism and health. And we're going to identify what it means to be anti-racist. And we're going to view some anti-racist possibilities for yourself and for your organization. And lastly, we are going to look at and learn a little bit about what the LRCC has been doing and is doing to push anti-racist advocacy within our space and within our community. So first, let's define some terms, right? We keep hearing this adage being tossed around that we live in the most divided or most polarized time of the modern era. And I don't know that I can agree with that, because when I see pictures of times before I was alive, and I see water fountains that say colored and white, I don't know what is more polarizing or dividing than segregation, but I can get on board with the idea that we are more polarized in a post-segregation era. And so as we're polarized, as we are so divided as a country and as a people and as communities oftentimes, I think one of the divides is oftentimes we are talking and using terminology, and oftentimes we aren't talking about the same definitions of these terms. And so let's just level set a little bit and dive in, because I think it is very important to have an understanding of what we mean when we talk about these terms. Trying to categorize race was in 1776, right? And these are the racial categories that they defined. And conveniently, these categories helped European Americans feel better about owning slaves, suggesting that only people of superior or white races were deserving of freedom. And so over time, these categories changed based on what is convenient for the people in power. So today, racial categories are defined a little bit differently, right? So what does that tell us, right? That racial categorizations are made up, that they're fluid, that they change over time, right? And they're created by the group or the category in power, usually in an attempt to maintain or grow this power. Now, racial identity, now, however, this is real, right? This is based on things like biological heritage, physical appearance, socialization, personal experiences, and each person gets to define that racial identity for themselves. Now that we have some sort of understanding of the fluidity of the term race, how do we define racism, right? And this isn't always easy. So here are some definitions that I want to go through, right? Because racism is not only a prejudice, a hatred, or discrimination, but it's all of those things plus power, right? Another definition of racism that the Alberta Civil Liberties Research Center talks about is racism is this top-down exercise of power, and it's systemic subjugation of one social group by the more powerful social group to benefit the latter, right? In this case, we're talking about white America. And so when we look at some of the prejudices and we look at that added, to power, this is what we're talking about when we're talking about racism. And so what does racism look like in practice, right? So it's the status quo. It's the normal way that society does business and the common everyday experiences had by people of color. And it's so ingrained, like in our society, that it's easy for some of us to deny its existence, right? And whether you realize it or not, racism benefits every single white person. So you can imagine how easy or excuse me, how difficult, or there's no incentive to actually acknowledge it, let alone fight it. And then this emphasizes about our differences rather than our similarities, and vice versa when it's convenient. And so this fluid and flexible definition of race can change over time to serve the many interests of the people in power. And oftentimes it's driven by this motive to create profit through the exploitation of marginalized groups. And so here we're going to look at some of the kinds of racism, right? Racism can be individual, it can be institutional, it can be intentional, it can be covert. And so in relation to recovery organizations like myself and Voices of Hope and other organizations like ours, we mostly discuss institutional and structural racism and the manifestations of that. So here, shifting gears to look at some other concepts here of white privilege, right? One of these hot button words that gets tossed around a lot and oftentimes gets misconstrued in our conversations. And the Racial Equity Resource Guide defines white privilege as an unquestioned and unlearned set of advantages, entitlements, benefits, and choices. I like that they have choices in there. Choices bestowed upon people solely because they are white. And I love this illustration here of the man on the left looking over to the right and saying, what's the matter? It's the same distance, right? Yes, maybe this journey is the same distance, but he's negating to see the barriers that are in front of this woman, right? And oftentimes in America, a lot of these barriers have been placed from our own federal government, the policies that are in place. and the society norms, the white supremacy society norms that our country was quite frankly built upon and still operates today. And so here's another term that is kind of takes you aback sometimes, right? We hear the word white supremacy. And so defining white supremacy as this idea that white people and their ideas and their thoughts and their beliefs and actions are superior to those of people of color. It's also this political and socioeconomic system where white people enjoy structural advantages, rights that other racial groups do not, whether that's collectively or individually. And so oftentimes when we hear the words white supremacy, we think of the top of the pyramid, those overt acts of white supremacy, right? We think of the KKK, we think of neo-Nazis, racial slurs, lynchings, things of that nature. And oftentimes we don't think of the covert. And what I want you to see out of this illustration is that the things that we say, hey, we don't do, we're not a part of, this overt white supremacy at the top of that pyramid cannot exist if the bottom of the pyramid does not support it. And so when we think about all of these things that are depicted in here that happen within our organizations, happen within ourselves, happen within our community, all of those things support and make it possible for the overt white supremacy to even exist. And so that's why it is so important for us to dismantle and eradicate the covert white supremacy culture and really analyze our policies, our procedures, and speak truth to power and all of these things that we've been talking about today. And so some more terms that I think it would behoove you to be familiar with would be tone policing, right? Conversational tactic that dismisses content from a conversation because of a perceived way that it was presented, right? So an example, I have to say that the language you are using is really harsh. If you were only nicer or changed your tone a little bit, you might get more people or might get white people to listen or have better outcomes, right? Oftentimes we hear a tone of somebody who might be distraught or might be a part of the system, and they get dismissed because of the tone of the voice or something struck us, and we're not listening to the content. And we call that tone policing, right? Respectable politics is another one. When marginalized folks are told or taught or even teach themselves that to receive better treatment from the oppressed group, that they must behave better, right? This shifts blame. So the problem isn't, respectable politics, because respectable politics isn't going to save someone's life, right? We've seen police hurt people even when they do the quote unquote right thing. We think of Philando Castile, right? And we've seen quote unquote respectable Black men being treated unfairly, like Senator Tim Scott, right? He reported that in 1 year recently, he was pulled over and harassed by law enforcement 7 times. 7 times. And so no matter how many yes sirs and no ma'ams and excuse me's and thank yous and college degrees, we'll mitigate this racism that people are experiencing. Then we think about microaggressions, right? This form of covert racism that is consisting of everyday little indignities, put downs or insults, or even really more so even actions, right? Say a Black man's going to get on an elevator and he notices that maybe a white woman or a white man or just anybody else clenches their purse or checks their wallet or even lets them go on the elevator and doesn't get on the elevator to ride up. Then there's a million examples that we could dive into, but I just want to give you some terms to familiarize yourself with and maybe prompt you to learn more, right? And we think about code switching, right? And I think the panel talked to some of this without really saying the words, but when we think about the ability or the onus for people to switch their languages and dialects and how they communicate or alter their clothing or their hair, right? And sometimes how we alter our communication, you might think, well, that's okay, right? Maybe I'm an ICU doctor, and how I talk to my patients in the hospital is probably going to be different than I talk to my partner or my children at home. But what we're talking about is where people of color have to learn to navigate this white world and change maybe the language or the clothes or the dialects that they're using in order to navigate this world, right? And so there's also an inverse to this code switching that I have personally witnessed recently, and I've also heard stories, countless stories of this happening. And I don't want to get into too far down this rabbit trail and get into politics, but I witnessed this. And so walking through a store with a friend of mine who's a Black man, and coming toward us is somebody wearing a Make America Great hat again. And as we pass, this gentleman looks dead in my friend's face and says, "Trump 2020. Now, as much as I want to give this guy the benefit of the doubt and say, hey, maybe he's maybe he's stumping for the re-election, no, that was code switching. That was a racial slur that he was saying without saying the racial slur. And so we have to be cognizant of these words and phrases that get used to diminish and to oppress other people. And then minority taxing. And this is one that I really want you to do some research on and really get to know, because this is what happens in organizations and has happened in organizations for a very, very, very long time, right? These are the additional responsibilities placed on minority groups to increase organizational diversity, to educate on matters of race and identity, right? One woman was quoted by saying, once hired, whether explicit or implicitly stated, there is this expectation to represent our otherness broadly across an institution for the good of the community, and often at the expense of me or us or the individual, right? And so oftentimes this is what happens. Individuals, people of color will be asked to explain things in group meetings or lead diversity and equity and inclusion trainings and stuff like this, and they will be very minimally compensated, if at all. And this is what we call minority taxing. And so now we're going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to talk just briefly about some of the impacts that the war on drugs has had here in our society and in our communities. And so we see this quote: the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies: the anti-war left and Black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing them both heavily, we could disrupt their communities, we could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about drugs? Of course we did. That's the domestic policy chief of the United States of America. I just want that to sink in. And so who do we, incarcerate here in America, right? In America, we incarcerate more people than anywhere else in the world by a long shot, right? By most all of the other countries combined, with the exception of China and Brazil there, but we incarcerate at extreme rates. And the people that have spoken before me have spoken to this. And we know that people of color are even more disproportionately affected by this. And so let's look at that. Who do we incarcerate, right? Black people at massively disproportionate rates. And who else do we incarcerate, right? Poor people. And why do we incarcerate them? Why is this mass incarceration happening, right? These drug charges, right? 40% of the federal penitentiary is filled with people on drug charges. And Alex already told us that 80% of the people in the federal penitentiary on drug charges are people of color. And so has our approach worked? Are we attacking addiction? Or what are we doing? I'm going to say a hard and fast no. We've spent, $1.5 trillion between the years of 1970 and 2010, and we haven't seen the needle move on the addiction rate in those same years. And when we think about the opioid epidemic recently, as we saw this downward trend in overdose deaths, 2018 and the beginning of 2019, overall, that statistic is real, right? But what we don't talk about is throughout those same years, there's been a huge increase in the Black community of overdose deaths. And I want to show this too, because this is part of us falling asleep, and I don't want us to do that again. And so this new administration just signed an executive order abolishing privatized prisons, right? And this effort is great, and it's moving in the right direction. So please hear me when I say that. However, private prison complex only makes up 9% of the prison population. So what's next? What's next? We got to keep going. We got to go further, and we can't break our arms patting ourselves on the back for small wins like this. Yes, it was great. It was great, and it's in the right direction. But what's next? And let's shift gears one more time. And we're going to talk a little bit about racism and health, right? So we don't talk about race and health. Oftentimes we talk around it, right? And this softens the issue, and it shields the crux of the cause of poor health. We often discuss this idea of race as a social determinant of health, when in reality is that racism is actually the cause of the negative health outcomes, right? We're not thinking about redlining that creates the communities to have poorer health outcomes, or the horrendous banking policies that don't allow individuals to get the loans that they need to own their own property. And all of these things that historically have happened in our country and still happen today, all of these things go into recovery capital and social determinants of health. But it's the racism that is impacting those health outcomes. We've already talked about race is not real, that it's a construct. So how can that be the determinant of health? It's not. And so what we need to do, in my humble opinion, is we need to shift to a perspective that allows us to address these racial inequities before they have a chance to impact health. And you might say, well, why don't people of color receive good health care, right? Well, 96% of Black Americans report experiencing racism and discrimination on a daily basis, right? Depression for Black men is up 4 times in the past couple decades. Suicide is the 3rd leading cause of death in Black males 15 to 24, right? Hate crimes are at their highest level in a decade, with Black Americans being the most targeted. Why is racism a public health issue, right? In the United States, Black men and boys are more likely to be killed by cops than their white counterparts, right? We know that people of color are more likely to be casualties of COVID-19. We know that these communities of color are disproportionately affected by poverty and economic distress, right? Access to healthcare. And what do you think it does to a community when they have to witness the death of their community over and over and over again? And not only witnessing this death, but having people downplay it and protect it. I mean, it has devastating effects on mental health. Oh, and Martin Luther King in 1966, before he took the stage, he was on an interview, and he said, "We are concerned about the constant use of federal funds to support this most atrocious expression of segregation. Of all the forms of inequity, injustice in health is the most shocking and the most inhuman because it often results in physical death. I see no alternative to direct action and creative nonviolence to raise the conscience of the nation." I think that's a good segue to talk about anti-racism, right? And so in discussing anti-racism, it's important to describe an individual's or our own relationship to the work, right? Where do we stand, right? Are we active? Are we joining in negative behavior as an adversary? Or are we just passive in that role where, hey, I'm not the one saying these things, I'm not the one implementing these things, I'm just Switzerland over here, I'm just in this neutral corner? Or are we educating ourselves and moving from being a passive maybe ally into active allyship, right? Are we educating ourselves and interrupting the behaviors within ourselves first, internally, and then externally? How are we disrupting these behaviors and interrupting and educating and having organized responses, right? Where are we on this spectrum? And I think it's important that we identify where we are individually and collectively. And we're going to go through some more ways to look at that within yourself and your organization. And here are some terms that oftentimes get thrown around and equated with one another or interchanged, is equality and equity, right? So equality is this assumption that everyone benefits from the same supports, and equity is that everybody gets the support they need. So think about a community on one side of a city or a state that is thriving, and then you think about another community on the other side of the city that is decimated. And so would we want equality? Would we want the same amount of investment and same amount of resources going equally to both communities? I think not, right? No, we would want to pump more into the community that is not thriving so that it can thrive, right? And what we also want to work toward is this idea of justice, that the systemic barriers are removed. Right, we're addressing this, that we're not just pumping investment, and we're not just looking at equity. Right, it's good, equity is great, don't get me wrong, but we want justice. We want to not just make resources and have workarounds to make equity, but we want justice and reparations and reconciliation and all of these things that Shelton and the rest of the crew today we're talking about. And so there's no in between here, or no safe space of being not racist, right? The only way to dismantle racism is to constantly identify it and consistently describe it. And this concept, it's not static. It's an ongoing process. So you can be racist or not racist 1 minute, and you can be anti-racist another. It's what we do and what we say in every single moment that determines kind of what we are or who we are in that moment. So the need to shift the locus from changing groups of people to changing policies, and from focusing on power instead of focusing on people, right? And so being not racist is a cop-out, right? It's accepting the status quo of white supremacy, and it deflects this responsibility of confronting racism within ourselves and within our lives and within the work that we do. And so the reality is that with racism, there is no neutrality. You're either the oppressor or you're the transformer. You either benefit or you fight back. And anti-racist work identifies, exposes, dismantles issues of power and politics. And anti-racism or anti-racist activity confronts these systems of white supremacy and seeks justice for all those who are oppressed by it. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the work that we do and have done and are going to do in the future at the LRCC. And we are no means any experts in this space. But what we are willing to do is be courageous and step into the arena. And we're willing to be held accountable when we're wrong, and we're willing to learn as we go. And so we start by looking at having an anti-racism plan, right? Engage, encourage, and empower have always been our tagline, if you will. And so we want to incorporate that into our plan, or our 5 pillars, if you will, of engaging the community and our stakeholders, encouraging this work of anti-racism, and providing resources when possible or when asked, empowering marginalized and oppressed groups. We want to do things that advance the cause, and we want to be accountable, and we want to hold others accountable. We want to hold ourselves accountable. We want to be open to being held accountable, and we do this through critical assessments of ourselves and having other people assess us as well. So when I think about how we engage in our community, I'm going to give you a few examples on each one of these kind of pillars, if you will. And so one way, or some ways that we've engaged our community, is holding community events that explore white privilege or white supremacy culture, and naming it in a flyer, and hosting these events, and being able to have a safe place to have these conversations, and be able to wrestle with these uncomfortable and awkward conversations, right? Facilitating groups with community partners on community trauma, or including racial trauma, and having other organizations who are therapists come in and host healing sessions with, you know, how we started doing some of these healing sessions with the therapist was when an individual was shot and killed and murdered in the Injustice Square in downtown Louisville, and hundreds of people were part of this active shooter and witnessed this murder. And so we wanted to create a safe place where people could come and debrief and talk about that trauma that they experienced, right? We've hosted think tanks with multiple organizations on how to create anti-racist solutions in our communities, right? We were a safe house, and will continue to be a safe house. But when the protests were amped up in Louisville, Kentucky, we wanted to be a supply hub, and there were several nights where I would be at the LRCC all night. People needed some refuge, people needed supplies, and so we were there for our community. We were there. We are located in downtown Louisville, where all of this was happening, and so we sprung to action for the community because the community had needs. And one way we're going to encourage is our new mobile recovery unit that we are in partnership with the Voices of Hope, right? And so oftentimes in our organizations and in the work that we do in the recovery community and mental health and healthcare, we throw around this phrase that we're going to meet you where you are. And really what that means is we're going to meet you mentally and emotionally where you are, because you got to get to us. And so with Kentucky's first mobile units going to be launched in Lexington with the Voices of Hope, in Louisville with the LRCC, we are literally and figuratively going to meet people where they are. We are going to go to the neighborhoods that have been marginalized and have lack of resources, and we are going to take the resources there, and we're going to plug them into other resources. We're going to go to these homeless encampments and get them plugged into the things they need, right? And so something else, how we're going to engage our community is a new partnership that we've created with the Roots 101 African American Museum, right? We're going to host Black History events at least once a month, every month, for the foreseeable future. I hope we never stop doing that. But you know, February is coming up and it's Black History Month, and we don't want to just have Black History Month be February. Black history is all of our history. It is American history. It is all of our history, period, point blank. And so we are going to host those to engage our community. And then we think about encouraging, right? How do we encourage anti-racism, and how do we provide resources, right? So one thing that we have done and continue to do is offer our space free of charge and our time to community leaders and Black community leaders and organizations to host workshops, to host direct action trainings, to do art builds. All of the art that you've seen throughout this presentation and will continue to see in this presentation was made in the LRCC and was made by staff and volunteers and participants and activists. And, you know, oftentimes people in the recovery community in Louisville and the recovery community at large, and Phil spoke to this, have given me pushback, have given me and my staff pushback of staying in our lane and things of that nature. And I just have to share the beauty in doing this, because when we open up our space for other people to collaborate and come in, and they themselves aren't in recovery, or they're not a recovery organization, what we're doing is building community. We're building relationships and being relational and not transactional. And it's my belief, and Shamika spoke to this, but it's my firm belief that everyone is in recovery from something. And so the beauty of when we engage with community partners who aren't in recovery in themselves or their organization is that their loved one, their mom, their dad, their aunt, their uncle, their brother, their cousin, somebody in their life has been affected by homelessness, by mental health issues, substance use disorder, and they're able to get their loved ones help, or they're able to plug into some of the resources that we have, or some of the resources that we partner with, and they're able to get the hope and the healing and from the traumas that they've experienced. Because addiction and the opioid epidemic and the crack epidemic, all of these things, the prison pipeline, they affect us all as a community, and we're all better off for those collaborations. And so when people tell me to stay in my lane, I'll say, well, we're a community center and we're building community. So I guess you're right. I am staying in my lane, and I'll be unapologetic about that. And we support and have hosted RA meetings, which are Racist Anonymous 12-step meetings. This started several years ago out in San Francisco, and it's an adaptation of the original 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, but it explores your own bias. And it doesn't just stop with racism. It goes through all the isms, able-bodyism, xenophobia, all of these things, homophobia, and you get to explore all of that stuff within yourselves. And there's a support group to where you can be there and you can own those parts of yourself where you have those bias. And it's a safe place to own that and not feel like you're going to get that you're going to get judged or beat up. And people need a safe place to be able to wrestle with these ideas, because some of this stuff, racism and these things like that, they're ingrained in us so deep that oftentimes we don't even see it. And so we need these safe places to be able to unpack this stuff and to be able to learn from one another, right? We have intentionally created sections in our newsletters to educate the public on anti-racist topics and language and events. And so we have a section in our newsletter that's always going to be dedicated to person-centered language and recovery language, but also looking at racist language and phrases we use. You know, for an example, a phrase that gets thrown around a lot that many people might not know where it comes from, because it's even written into legislation and laws and stuff all the time, is this grandfather clause, right? Say I'm licensed to practice something here in Kentucky, and I move to Ohio or I move to another state. With my experience and with some sort of licensure or credential, oftentimes when you move to another state, they will grandfather you in, right? You're saying, well, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that came from legislation years and years and years ago, where the efforts to suppress voting rights of freed slaves the law stated that in order to be able to vote, all of your grandparents had to have been born in America. And most of the freed slaves, a lot of their grandparents weren't born in America. And so it was just a way to suppress the vote, and it was steeped in white supremacy. And we use terms like that all of the time and have no earthly idea the origin of them. And we always talk about language matters and words matter, and they do. And so how we can educate ourselves and educate our community on terms and phrases like this to dismantle them and eradicate them is very important work. And we'll have resources and signs in our space that will speak to anti-racism and racism in general. And we think about how to empower individuals. And in similar fashion to inviting folks in that might not be in recovery from substance use disorder, something we were able to do through some private donations was partner with local youth groups and local Black youth groups, and we were able to hire them, pay them to come do outreach to our houseless population. And what we would do is We would go over a safety briefing and tell them what we're about to go do. And we would put together all of the food and all the supplies. And we would go out on the streets and we would do outreach and we would help people. And then we would come back to the LRCC and we would have therapists, sometimes an art therapist, sometimes a music therapist, sometimes just a psychotherapist. And we'd circle up and we'd do drum circles and we would do different things to help process what they experienced, right? And invariably, these children, these adolescents started opening up, and almost every single one of them, some of them had just experienced their parent passing away from a drug overdose, or being separated from their parents who are experiencing homelessness. And so we're able to help them process through that, and they know where to come get help. And then to empower them even more, we could ask them questions like, if you were the mayor, if you were the governor, if you were the president of the United States, what would be some ways that you would combat drug addiction and homelessness and all of these problems that we saw collectively together, and allow them to dream big, and not just dream that they too could be the mayor or the president of the United States, but to have input on some of the work that we do, right? And something I'm really excited about that we're kicking off this year that's been in the works are utopian future workshops, right? Posing questions like, what does a world without racism look like? And utopian future workshops are usually done in 3 parts. And the first part is to critically assess current systems, and anything goes, just spitfire and just critically assess the whole system, whatever system we're talking about. And then phase 2 is you dream. What does this perfect world look like? What does utopian Louisville look like? What does utopian Kentucky look like? What does utopian America look like? What does a world look like without racism? And there's only one rule. You can't go small. You have to dream big. And you spitfire that, all of these dreams and all of these things that some people would say is not reality. And then you get to look at the 3rd session at the 2, the critical assessment and the dream big. And then you come up together collectively with action steps of how we're going to get from here to here. And then we empower those groups to do those action steps. And Shelton, another way, Shelton has brought participatory defense to the LRCC, and I've had the distinct pleasure of being able to participate in participatory defense. And so what that looks like in a nutshell would be that individuals who are charged with a crime and might have a public defender, when you think of people that have private lawyers, usually private lawyers or private pay lawyers have a team, right? They have a team of people who can dig and find things and get affidavits, and they're really defending you. In the public defender's office, when they see you, they usually come in, if you're in custody especially, they're going to come in while you are in the courtroom, while you're back in the holding cell. They're going to come in 5 minutes, hopefully 5 minutes before court. Oftentimes it might even be after court has already started. They have 30 jackets of different people that they are servicing, and they haven't even looked at your case until they get in front of you, and they yell your name, and you come, you see them, and we know what happens there. Like, that's been depicted on this call or on this town hall already. And so what participatory defense does is the community comes together and acts as your defense team. And yes, we'll take evidence or go talk to people and get affidavits signed, and we'll take that to the public defender's office, or we'll do a ton of work on the back end collectively together as a community. And then the idea is, after you have been represented by participatory defense, you then come back and participate in somebody else's defense. And we do this as a community. because obviously the system is failing when it comes to these defenses. And so it is our job as a community to come together for this defense, right? And we've had, you know, Black community healing days where we've coupled art with mindfulness, with yoga, with food and massages, and had a silent disco and had therapists there, and just closed down for a private event on some days that we were off, and able to help individuals heal and be community. We've donated money to organizations that are the other organizations that are doing anti-racism work, and been able to partner on racial equity events. And so we think about advancing the cause. How can you as an organization, how can we as organizations advance the causes, right? So making anti-racism one of the core values of your organization, right? Being vocal about the work that we do, being vocal about the work that you do, and holding individuals and organizations and ourselves accountable, and creating opportunities to empower staff by having really meaningful input and control over programs. And if we're going to add responsibility to people of color to own programs, then we need to compensate them and not minority tax. And really another way, you know, holding ourselves accountable, some ways that we can do that is critically assess our policies, our procedures, our communications, and our data, right? We can look at our data and we can say, hey, let's look at all the zip codes that we service, and let's look at all the people that are in our database that we serve, and see where and who we are serving the most of, and where do we need to go to serve more people in these zip codes, right? And really looking at, okay, we serve this many people of color. Well, what's the population of people of color in our city, in our state? And really looking at who are we serving, how are we serving them, and how can we do better, right? How can we move from equity to justice, or from equality to equity to justice? Creating a safe environment. You know, one way to be accountable to each other is to create this safe environment for participants, for community members, and for our staff to be able to hold each other accountable, right? I fumble all of the time, and people will come to me and say, hey, did you ever think about the impact like that has on this group of people? And sometimes I say, I did, but I didn't think of it in that way. Like, thank you for bringing that to my attention. Because like Amanda Hall said, like, we're all learning, and we're all learning together. And so being able to accept that criticism and be able to, as leaders in your organizations, making it safe and explicit to your staff that you can be held accountable as the leader, that speaking truth to power is important. And as leaders, we hold power in our organizations, and we need to be able to create that safe place to get that feedback from our people that we lead, or that are, you know, in our circle of influence. And so when we look at data, we got to have the courage to make the changes that are needed, right? When we discover things, we have to make the changes that we discovered, right? And so you can look at your board demographics, right? How you know, looking at how many LGBTQ plus, how many women, how many people in recovery. We look at that. Your organization might not look at that. How many people of color? Looking at our staff, right? Looking at our partners. Who do we partner with, right? In our organization, 67% people of color, 50% women, 33% LGBTQIA. I am white middle-aged man, I am the minority within my organization and within all of the partnerships that we strategically have made over the years. And I'm okay with that. And who's directing the organization? The community needs are directing our organization. And I'm just, I'm lucky enough to help lead in that effort. But we have to listen to the community. We have to listen to the community. That's part of accountability. So here are some ways to take action. And here's just a few things that I want to highlight. I know we're about to come to a close, but Ohio State has this great 21-day anti-racism challenge. And so it goes through readings, it goes through videos to watch, it goes through kind of some written stuff that you can write and explore all of these concepts. And it comes with a checklist. And so you can check off what you did each day and try to get done in 21 days. I did not get done in 21 days. I'll be honest about that, but it's a worthwhile dive to do and really get into that internal work that I was talking about. Jane Elliott, too, side note that Jane Elliott has lots of materials on combating racism and looking at your bias as well. And she has a lot of tools and has kind of been a juggernaut in this space for a long, long time. And it's Jane Elliott. And so this is an evidence-based practical assessment for organizations' ability to promote intercultural competence. So that's something to dive into and be able to look at for you and your organization. And the Dismantling Racism Workbook is it's a community resource initially developed as a multi-day training that discusses how to confront racism and white supremacy culture individually, organizationally, and systemically. And so if we truly want to be anti-racist in our work, we can't just talk the talk. We have to put into action programming, planning, and these plans and programs are equitable and justice-centered. We must remember that our actions have real impact and that intent doesn't always matter. It's not what we say, it's what we do, right? The impact on the lives of people of color, that we are responsible for any harms that we cause, and we are also responsible for the remedying of any harms that we cause. Those of you that might be in 12-step recovery, you know, we have a 9th step and a 10th step, and or they have those steps, right, of making amends, and I think the reconciliation part of remedying our wrongs is a very important part of building community and building equitable and just communities. And I love this quote, that the beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be anti-racist. Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including yourself. And it's the only way forward. So as we come to a close, I want to encourage you guys to be courageous in the work that you do within yourselves, within your organizations, within your communities, within your cities, within your states, within our nation. Just be courageous. We're gonna fumble, we're gonna fail, but we got to be in the arena, and we got to encourage each other to move in this direction. We can't fall asleep. coming to town halls and summits and us doing these things. They're great. They're great. But we have to keep it moving. We're going to do follow-ups. We're going to try to build community partnerships through all of these efforts. So my encouragement is to be courageous when you're exploring and acknowledging your own racism and looking for your own blind spots, right? Have those difficult conversations about racism and anti-racism with your circles of influence, whether that's your peers or your colleagues or your family members. And it's going to be awkward, and it's going to be ugly sometimes. I've lost friends, I've lost family members due to these conversations, or lost some time right now with them. But these conversations have to be had, and be courageous of being an advocate, right, for racially trauma-informed programs. Be courageous and speak truth to power, and calling out for the dismantlement of oppressive systems. And more importantly than anything, be courageous and listen. How are we really listening to understand and not listening to respond? I'll say that again. We need to be listening to understand and not listening to respond. And so learning when to speak up as an ally, and when to sit back and listen. And I want to leave you with words from the poet laureate Amanda Gorman. And I'm going to give my permission to cry. I'm going to give myself permission to cry if it happens, because I was very moved by her poem at the inauguration recently. And I'm not going to say the whole thing, but these specific parts really spoke to me. And she says, in part, being American is more than a pride we inherit. It is the past we step into and how we repair it. And she goes on further and says, we will rebuild, reconcile, and recover. And every known nook of our nation and every corner called our country, our people diverse and beautiful, will emerge battered and beautiful. When the day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. When the day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid, and the new dawn blooms as we free it. For there will always be light if we are brave enough to see it, and if we're brave enough to be it. Please be brave, please be courageous, and be that light. Thank you.
Jeremy, thank you so much for sharing with us tangible ways we can be a part of the solution, and you've given us a whole heck of a lot to think about. So I appreciate that. It's time to wrap up, and I want to conclude by relating a personal note. In serving as the moderator, I'd really intended to ask the questions and stay out of the way, but in talking and preparing with Shelton before today, and in learning about his story, I felt that there was really only one way for me to personally conclude today, and that's by telling you this. Like Shelton, when I was 18 years old, I was arrested on marijuana trafficking charges in excess of 8 ounces. The difference was I was arrested on the campus of Center College, a private liberal arts school in Kentucky, and more to the point, I'm white. From the day I was arrested, I spent 3 days in jail. And the only reason I spent 3 days and not 2 is because Monday was President's Day and the judge didn't come in. Shelton didn't get out for 4 years. I finished a bachelor's degree while Shelton served a prison sentence. And for what? That's the question that we want to pose here today. So we want to hear from you. We want to know what you've learned, what you intend to take back with you to your organizations, what ideas you have for making change. So we're going to be sending an evaluation via email. Please complete that evaluation and provide us with some feedback so we can help the recovery community improve the response to the war on drugs. And I'll close by just saying thank you all for joining us, and thank you for being allies in the fight to undo the harm of the war on drugs.